Hello and welcome to Skynet Today's Let's Talk AI podcast, where you can hear from AI researchers about what's actually going on with AI and what is just clickbait headlines. I am Andrey Kurenkov, a third-year PhD student at the Stanford Vision and Learning Lab. I focus mostly on learning algorithms for robotic manipulation in my research. And with me is my co-host.
I'm Sharon, a third-year PhD student in the machine learning group working with Andrey. I do research on generative models, improving generalization of neural networks, and applying machine learning to tackling the climate crisis.
And Sharon, I think you'll agree we have a lot to cover this week. It's been a very news-heavy week for AI and especially facial recognition.
Oh, yeah.
So I think we're just going to dive straight in. So the first article we have here is from Business Insider, and it is titled, "Outrage over police brutality has finally convinced Amazon, Microsoft, and IBM to rule out selling facial recognition tech to law enforcement. Here's what's going on." So this is a sort of overview article of a lot of the news that's been going on this week. So quoting from it, the summary is that IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft have all committed to not sell facial recognition to law enforcement, at least temporarily. This began on June 8th with IBM and actually a letter to Congress from its CEO, which stated that IBM would not sell facial recognition tech and also advocated for more regulation to be passed. This article notes that while activists have been campaigning for the companies to do this for years, the Black Lives Matter movement appears to have tipped the scale. As facial recognition becomes more widely used to catch criminals, illegal immigrants, or terrorists, there's mounting concern about how the technology might be abused. And as a result, each company, again, this is IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft, made subtly different promises with their bans.
Quite a few news sources also cover this, including the Wall Street Journal in an article called "Facial Recognition Companies Commit to Police Market After Amazon Microsoft Exit," and several other articles and venues, including Fast Company and CNET. I think in general, this is pretty big. I first heard about this when Amazon pulled out, and I was actually very impressed and honestly a little bit surprised, since I don't think we often view these companies as do-good type companies. So I was actually very impressed with that action being taken, and I'm glad. And I hope that like people internally to the company and throughout all the ranks believe this is the right decision.
Yeah, as you said, I think this is actually seemingly a pretty big deal. Amazon followed IBM with its announcement of a 1-year moratorium on police use of Amazon's facial recognition technology on June 10th. So it was a very swift order of events. And this is after years of criticism about this product recognition and it being biased. The Algorithmic Justice League has criticized it. And so this is a welcome development after a lot of activists calling for this to happen. Also, this article from Fast Company, which is titled "IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon's Face Recognition Bans Don't Go Far Enough," notes that while this is, of course, welcome and good, it's just the first step. So in IBM's case, they were already not really selling this facial analysis detection technology. So the announcement is a bit opportunistic. In Amazon's case, it's actually a welcome development, but it's just a 1-year moratorium. So I guess the next step would be for Congress and politicians to actually pass legislation to regulate this market.
That's right. And just to give you a sense of what's going on and how this facial recognition technology is being used with respect to the protests going on, BuzzFeed News had an article titled, "Here are the Minneapolis Police's Tools to Identify Protesters." So we've seen how the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, among many others, have sparked protests across the nation. The administration and a number of states have met the challenge with yet more policing, which is even worse. On top of that, the police have surveillance tools at their disposal. The Minneapolis Police Department in particular has used Clearview AI, which we've talked about in previous episodes, in addition to a plethora of other surveillance technologies. And while people engaging in protests for a good cause should not be subject to surveillance, these tools are definitely a danger. So facial recognition and other surveillance tools could lead to essentially protesters facing arrest and persecution well after the demonstrations have even ended. And so facial recognition, as another article points, is essentially law enforcement's newest weapon against protesters.
Indeed. Another article, which you just referenced, also noted that police in Seattle, Austin, Dallas, and even the FBI have used images of protesting, and they could, from these images, actually pick up on faces and follow up. So it seems this is a very real situation where there is this possible use case. And so, as we just mentioned, IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft not providing this product is meaningful in the sense of it could be used in this context. Although other companies such as Clearview AI, which is entirely based on selling facial recognition tech, are standing by their product and are still offering it. So it's still very possible for police departments to continue using facial recognition in this way.
I think some striking examples in the article are, quote, the Minneapolis Police Department also uses SecuroNet, which is a surveillance tool that lets police upload cell phone footage, integrate that with CCTV footage, and visualize it on a map. So the police department started using SecuroNet in 2017, ahead of the city's hosting of the 2018 Super Bowl. But this technology has lasted, and now the department has signed on another contract with SecuroNet in 2019. And of course, this is being used as well. And as noted in a surveillance white paper, law enforcement agencies operating in Minneapolis, like the state-run Minnesota BCA, actually have access to even more surveillance tools. So for instance, the Minnesota BCA has the ability to deploy something called Stingrays, which is a tool that mimics cell phone towers in order to approximate the location of cell phone users. And Stingrays have allegedly been used to target Black Lives Matter protesters.
Yeah, so it's very concerning to hear all these specific examples and to hear that at least some departments are using facial recognition tech as well. This article from BuzzFeed News also notes that Rich Neumeister, a Minneapolis resident, submitted written testimony to a city subcommittee on data practice on January 30th, urging the city to enact restrictions on the use of facial recognition, which did not exist. There aren't such restrictions. And he stated, I think quite eloquently, that there needs to be guardrails, standards, and curtailing policies so that the use and rules are not developed by law enforcement agencies in secret. Our privacy and civil liberties can be diminished if this onerous and powerful technology is not kept in check. So this is pretty high stakes. I think we would agree, Sharon, and it's good that the protests now are making us very aware and very concerned about these issues.
Yes, I think the protest now actually makes many more people concerned about these issues, which I think is very, very important, because before it might have been a smaller group of people. Something that I find pretty concerning related to Amazon, which did say that they would put that moratorium on, is that several local police departments in the Minneapolis metropolitan area actually have signed contracts with Ring, which is Amazon's home surveillance company, according to the company's map of active partnerships. And Ring actually these contracts with Ring actually give police access to the company's law enforcement portal, which then lets officers essentially request camera footage from residents without even obtaining a warrant first. And so that is huge. So in exchange, Ring has given police free cameras, and it's offered police more free cameras if they convince enough people to download their app called Neighbors, which is a neighborhood watch app. And so this is huge because as more and more people potentially use something like Ring, that could then help law enforcement take down essentially your neighbors in a weird, terrible way. And a staff attorney for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Sarah Hussein, told BuzzFeed News that the pervasiveness of surveillance technology could mean that protesters, and we mentioned this before, protesters actually face the risk of arrest long after demonstrations have even ended. And of course, people have started putting out things to combat this. For example, there's an article where there's an article where an app called Anonymous Camera uses AI to quickly anonymize photos and videos so that people could take pictures of, let's say, a crowd of protesters, and people would be anonymized there.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned Ring, and that's a good point here, that Amazon's year pause on facial recognition technology doesn't limit this contract with the police on using video from Ring. So in some ways, these announcements are pretty partial, and they are definitely meant to sort of signal some support while still being not necessarily going very far. In its statement, Amazon said it hoped the moratorium would give Congress enough time to implement appropriate rules, and we stand ready to help if requested. But in the past, Amazon has actually worked against strict rules for facial recognition, as noted by some of these articles. And Microsoft has also pushed against some ACLU-backed initiatives for moratoriums on government facial recognition. So I think it's a complicated situation. We shouldn't get complacent with the companies just because they have done these gestures. If anything, I think the actions by the companies show that activism and actually pointing out these issues and caring and pushing them works, and we should continue to do so and continue pushing our politicians to enact this legislation, and pretty soon, I would say, because the technology is already here.
Yes, I would definitely say that these companies are not leading in terms of things. It's more like they are responding to what we the people want, perhaps, or like vie for, and they need to keep their public image alive. And
on that note, actually, I think we should mention, this is not exactly news, but a lot of this activism started with the work of the Algorithmic Justice League, which is led by Joy Buolamwini and Timna Jabru, among others. So they pointed out these potential misuses for years now. And I think it's worth it to remember that while the company's actions are good, it came about because of the work of these activists and researchers. And they definitely should get a lot of commendation for all their work, which was, I think, ahead of its time, to be honest.
And rolling with the theme of surveillance, our next article is the ACLU is suing Clearview AI to stop privacy-destroying face surveillance. So if you've listened to this podcast in the past, you've almost certainly heard plenty about Clearview AI, which is the quote-unquote search engine for faces that allows law officers to identify you with a cell phone picture using the identification technology that it has developed by scraping billions of images from sites like Facebook, Twitter, etc. BuzzFeed broke a great deal of news about Clearview when it came out, including their contracts with many companies and firms, as well as private individuals that extended far beyond law enforcement and that questioned essential civil liberties. So the American Civil Liberties Union sued Clearview AI on May 28th, 2020, quote, arguing that the facial recognition startup violated the privacy of Illinois residents in amassing a database of more than 3 billion photos scraped from websites and social media platforms, including Facebook and Twitter. And also to note that Facebook and Twitter were not particularly happy with Clearview doing this as well.
Yeah, so some more details are that the lawsuit alleges that the facial recognition startup violated the state's Biometric Information Privacy Act, which is a 2008 law that prevents companies from collecting or storing fingerprints or scans of citizens' faces without their consent. So this is a state-level lawsuit because there isn't legislation on a federal level in the US to tackle this topic. And it seems like Illinois is actually one of the few states with relevant laws that can be used to protect people against facial recognition if they aren't giving their consent. And ACLU said that they actually are not looking monetary damages for people from Clearview AI, but an injunctive relief, which means that it wants Clearview to delete the face prints, the photos of people it illegally captured, and stop capturing them in the future. And this is on top of a slew of lawsuits, actually, in New York, California, Virginia, and Vermont, that is going up against this company.
And I guess responding to this, Clearview sees themselves as more of a, quote, search engine that uses only publicly available images on the internet. And of course, this tries to make them appear much more not quite doing as much harm. Oh, it's just a public scraping. It's just all public data. But of course, misuse is abound, and you can't just misuse data even if it's public.
Yeah, I think to that point, it's kind of an interesting question, somewhat. We are both researchers, and so we have websites that showcase our research and have photos of our face, and we almost have to do that, at least the website part. And it's very common to have photos of researchers in various places. But I personally feel that just because I have a website with my name on it and my photo with a nice sort of headshot, it doesn't mean that I want companies like Clearview to be able to gather this data and have me searchable by face. So anyone can potentially look me up from a photo. And I would imagine, Sharon, you agree that your intention with your website is not for Clearview to be able to scrape it and use that photo data.
I actually don't have my face on my website, but that aside, yes, I would not want Clearview to be doing that. And of course, this is a fine line. Like, oh, Twitter and Facebook encourage us to upload our photos. Facebook in particular asks us to tag our friends. At what point is that okay? And do our friends give consent to being tagged? You know, all this stuff. So where's that line? What if we don't know what it's going to be used for? And there's all sorts of things there. So it's a very fine line, I think.
And so on that fine line, we can actually move to the next article titled "Researchers Call for New Federal Authority to Regulate Facial Recognition Tech." And this was actually a summary of this call by the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And it is about how a group of artificial intelligence experts, including computer vision researcher and lead author Eric Learned Miller from this university, have proposed a new model for managing facial recognition technologies at the federal level, quoting from this post. They released a white paper titled "Facial Recognition Technologies in the Wild, a Call for Federal Office," and proposed an FDA-inspired model that categorizes technologies by degrees of risk and would institute corresponding controls for this FDA-type authority. The researchers highlight the high-stakes nature of the use of this technology and the resulting need for a solution involving an entire federal office and not necessarily just a law. And so I suppose, to your point of a fine line, the idea of these researchers is there would be an ongoing body within the government to actually think about these issues, keep track of what uses exist, how data is being collected and used, and basically be in charge of it, which seems, as someone who doesn't know too much, but seems like a sensible idea given how much we are seeing going on even just right now already.
I think this movement has definitely galvanized this push among researchers. I think this has always been kind of a question among researchers. Some people kind of on one side versus the other. There hasn't been as strong a push until now, I believe, but it's always been a question, I believe, and that people have likened this to healthcare. You know, how much are we going to regulate AI? But I think this has really catalyzed this. And by this, I mean, this movement has really catalyzed essentially researchers to question and start to put together a set of regulations from the researcher perspective, not even from the external perspective. And so I think that is really, really great.
One other thing to note about this white paper is that this was done in collaboration with the Algorithmic Justice League, which focuses a lot of these issues. And so it focuses on facial recognition. It also focuses on auditing companies of commercial AI products. So I guess it's interesting how as AI becomes more and more useful and powerful, and there are these applications that develop from the AI research community and start to be commercialized, we as researchers will need to become a little more aware of the implications of the technology, and even as the Algorithmic Justice League is doing, kind of opinionated about the needed regulation and needed actions by the government, and I think supportive of measures and more, activist-like, given our awareness of the technology. I think it is up to us to be supportive of regulation and limiting power and application of technologies when it's too early. I'm curious, Sharon, have you seen this group, the Algorithmic Justice League? Have you heard of their research much before this week?
I have not. So I'm very happy to have heard they exist and that such organizations exist that work closely with researchers. And I think perhaps PJ Reddy, who we talked about previously, who is a well-known computer vision researcher who actually publicly stepped away from computer vision research because he saw his research was being used for ill means. So I wonder if he's associated with it in some way.
Indeed. And this is one of several companies like this that I'm aware of that I've just seen throughout the years. There's also a campaign or organization titled the Campaign Against Killer Robots, which is focused on legislation regarding autonomous weapons and using AI for military technology. So it is interesting how I guess we now have this model of nonprofit where AI expertise connects to activism and kind of legal activism. And this is a new thing for researchers who are particularly concerned, where, as you say, if they feel there are these very ominous use cases, they can apply their expertise and work at these activist organizations to try and shape things in the good direction so that AI is used in healthy ways and not misused, which I guess we'll see more and more of in this next few years and as AI keeps growing.
And with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Let's Talk AI podcast. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at skynettoday.com.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to leave us a rating if you like the show.
Be sure to tune in next week.